The quest for transformation has haunted humanity since the first moment consciousness turned inward and recognized its own incompleteness. Long before the laboratory alchemists of medieval Europe bent over their crucibles, seeking to transmute lead into gold, there existed a more ancient understanding, one that recognized the metals as symbols, the fires as metaphors, and the entire alchemical enterprise as a coded language for the transformation of the soul itself. At the heart of this esoteric tradition stands the Emerald Tablet, a cryptic text attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the legendary synthesis of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth. The document itself, no more than a dozen enigmatic lines, has captivated philosophers, mystics, and psychologists for over a millennium. Its most famous declaration, "As above, so below," has become so ubiquitous that its revolutionary implications are often overlooked. This is not mere poetic symmetry. It is an epistemological claim about the structure of reality itself, suggesting that the macrocosm and microcosm mirror one another, that the laws governing the cosmos are recapitulated within the individual psyche. The historical origins of the tablet remain obscured by centuries of legend and apocrypha. The earliest known versions appear in Arabic texts from the 8th century, though the tradition claims a far more ancient provenance, some placing it in the hands of Alexander the Great, others in the tomb of Hermes himself. What matters for our inquiry is not the archaeological authenticity of these claims, but rather the text's psychological potency. The Emerald Tablet survived precisely because it addressed a perennial human need, the desire for a systematic method of self-overcoming, a technology of the soul that could guide the individual from fragmentation toward wholeness. Carl Jung, the Swiss depth psychologist who would later revolutionize our understanding of the unconscious mind, recognized in the alchemical tradition something his contemporaries had dismissed as primitive superstition. Where others saw only failed chemistry, Jung perceived a sophisticated psychological system, one that had developed its own symbolic language to describe the process of individuation, the painful and necessary journey towards psychological integration. The alchemists, Jung argued, were projecting their own unconscious processes onto matter, and in doing so, they created an elaborate map of inner transformation that would prove remarkably compatible with modern depth psychology. The Emerald Tablet opens with an assertion of absolute certainty. True it is without falsehood, certain and most true. This is not the language of scientific hypothesis or tentative exploration. It is the voice of revealed knowledge, of gnosis, a knowing that transcends mere intellectual comprehension. The text immediately establishes itself as speaking from a position of authority that does not derive from empirical observation, but from direct apprehension of fundamental principles. The core doctrine can be distilled into several interrelated axioms. First, the principle of correspondence. That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to accomplish the miracles of one thing. This is not simple analogy, but a claim about the fundamental unity of existence. The forces that structure the cosmos, attraction and repulsion, expansion and contraction, manifestation and dissolution, are the same forces that structure the individual psyche. To understand one's own mind is therefore to understand the universe. To transform oneself is to participate in cosmic transformation. Second, the text asserts a generative principle. And as all things were by contemplation of one, so all things arose from this one thing by a single act of adaptation. Here we encounter a proto-philosophical monism, the idea that the multiplicity of phenomena emerges from a singular source. In psychological terms, this suggests that the fragmented contents of consciousness, the warring drives, the contradictory desires, the multiplicity of sub-personalities, all originate from a unified center, what Jung would later call the self. The work of transformation, then, is not the creation of something new, but the recovery of an original wholeness that has been lost or forgotten. The tablet goes on to describe the elements required for the great work. Its father is the sun, its mother the moon. The wind carries it in its belly, its nurse is the earth. This elemental symbolism points toward the union of opposites as the fundamental mechanism of transformation. The sun represents consciousness, clarity, masculine principle. The moon represents the unconscious receptivity, feminine principle. The wind, associated with spirit or pneuma, mediates between these polarities, while the earth provides the material ground in which transformation can occur. Jung's interpretation of these symbols is psychologically precise. The sun corresponds to the ego, the center of conscious awareness and rational thought. The moon represents the unconscious, that vast realm of forgotten memories, repressed desires, and archetypal patterns that exist beneath the threshold of awareness. The alchemical marriage of sun and moon is thus the integration of conscious and unconscious, a process Jung termed individuation. This is not the victory of consciousness over the unconscious, nor the dissolution of ego into oceanic oneness, but rather a dynamic equilibrium in which both poles are honored and held in creative tension. The text's instruction to separate the earth from fire, the subtle from the gross, gently and with great ingenuity, describes the process of discrimination, the careful work of distinguishing what is essential from what is peripheral, what serves growth from what impedes it. This is psychological discernment, the capacity to observe one's own mental processes without identification, to recognize patterns without being enslaved by them. It requires what the text calls great ingenuity, not brute force or rigid discipline, but a kind of gentle, persistent attention. Perhaps most significantly, the tablet concludes with a promise. Thus you will obtain the glory of the whole universe. All obscurity will be clear to you. This is the greatest force of all powers, because it overcomes every subtle thing and penetrates every solid thing. The goal of the work is not mere personal happiness or psychological adjustment, but a fundamental transformation of perception itself. The adept gains access to what the text calls the glory of the whole universe, a mode of seeing that penetrates beyond appearances to the underlying patterns that structure reality. This is the philosopher's stone, not as a physical substance but as a state of consciousness, a way of being in the world that is no longer deceived by the surface play of phenomena. The alchemical tradition, drawing on the cryptic wisdom of the emerald tablet, developed an elaborate sequence of operations that mapped the stages of psychological transformation. While various texts describe these operations differently, a fundamental pattern emerges, one that Jung recognized as corresponding to the natural unfolding of the individuation process. The work begins with Nigredo, the blackening. This is the stage of dissolution, when the structures that have organized the personality begin to break down. In the alchemical imagery, the matter placed in the vessel becomes black, putrefies, dies. Psychologically, this corresponds to the encounter with the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we have disowned, repressed, or refused to acknowledge. The comfortable illusions we maintain about who we are begin to crack. We discover that we are not as noble as we believed, not as consistent, not as unified. The persona, the social mask we present to the world, reveals itself as just that, a mask, not the totality of who we are. This encounter is rarely voluntary. It is typically precipitated by crisis, the loss of a relationship, the failure of a career, an illness, a confrontation with mortality. Something we depended upon for our sense of identity proves unreliable, and we are thrown into confusion. The temptation at this stage is to flee, to distract ourselves, to rebuild the old structures as quickly as possible, to deny the validity of what we've glimpsed. But the alchemical texts are clear. One must descend fully into the Nigredo. Visit the interior of the earth, the tablet instructs, and by rectifying you shall find the hidden stone. The descent is not optional. The shadow must be integrated, not merely acknowledged intellectually, but genuinely felt and accepted as part of oneself. Following the Nigredo comes Albedo, the whitening. If blackening is dissolution, whitening is purification. The contaminated matter, having been broken down, is now cleansed. Psychologically, this corresponds to the emergence of new insight, a clarity that follows the confusion of the shadow encounter. One begins to see patterns, to recognize how the ego's strategies have created its own suffering. There is often a sense of relief at this stage, even elation. The worst has been faced and survived. Light returns, But the alchemists warn against stopping here. The white state, while beautiful, is incomplete. It represents a kind of spiritual purity that is not yet fully embodied, not yet integrated into actual life. In Jung's terms, this is the danger of the puer aeternus, the eternal youth who remains in the realm of potential, of pure spirit, unable or unwilling to engage with the messy realities of embodied existence. The white stone is not the philosopher's stone. More work remains. The third major stage is Rubedo, the reddening. This is the stage of integration, when the insights gained are not merely understood but lived. The red color symbolizes blood, life, vitality, the return to the body and to the world, but now transformed. What has been learned in the depths must be brought back to the surface and enacted. In psychological terms, this is the hard work of changing actual behavior, of establishing new patterns, of embodying wisdom rather than merely contemplating it. The Rubedo involves what Jung called the conjunctio oppositorum, the conjunction of opposites. This is not a mere compromise between polarities, but a genuine synthesis in which both poles are preserved and transcended. Masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, spirit and matter, individual and collective, these pairs are not collapsed into uniformity, but held in dynamic tension, each enriching the other. The result is what the alchemists depicted as the hermaphrodite or the royal couple, a union that is simultaneously one and two, singular and plural. Throughout these stages runs a fundamental principle articulated in the Emerald Tablet. Ascend from earth to heaven, and descend again to earth, and unite together the powers of things superior and things inferior. This is the circulation, the endless rhythm of the work. One does not simply ascend to spiritual heights and remain there. One must descend again, bringing the treasure back to ordinary life, and then ascend again, for the work is never truly complete. Each cycle of ascent and descent deepens the integration, makes the union more stable, more real. Jung emphasized that this process could not be rushed or forced. The alchemical texts consistently stress patience, the need to work with natural timing rather than against it. The matter must be heated gently, not with violent fire. Each operation must be completed before moving to the next. Attempting to skip stages leads not to acceleration, but to catastrophe, what the alchemists called the explosion of the vessel. Psychologically, this might manifest as inflation, delusion, or psychotic break. The psyche has its own rhythm, and the work of transformation must respect that rhythm. The operations are also cyclical rather than linear. One does not complete the Nigredo once and for all, never to return. Life presents new challenges, new shadows, new material for integration. Each cycle, however, occurs at a deeper level. The same pattern repeats, but each time one brings more awareness, more capacity, more wholeness to the encounter. The spiral deepens. What emerges from this process, if it is followed faithfully, is not a perfected self, but a more authentic one. A personality that is more unified, more flexible, more capable of responding to reality as it is, rather than as one wishes it to be. The goal produced by the alchemical work is not the ego triumphant, having vanquished all opposition but the self-realized, having integrated the opposites into a living whole. No discussion of transformation can avoid the encounter with despair. The alchemical texts, for all their optimism about the final result, do not minimize the suffering involved in the work. The matter must be tortured, putrefied, dissolved, killed. These are not gentle metaphors. They describe the felt experience of psychological disintegration, the sensation that one is losing one's mind, that the structures of meaning that have organized life are collapsing, that there is nothing solid to hold on to. The crisis typically arrives at the transition between Nigredo and Albedo, in that darkest hour when the old self has died, but the new has not yet been born. Jung called this the night sea journey, borrowing the image from mythological narratives in which the hero is swallowed by a whale or monster and must find a way to emerge from its belly. In the darkness, disoriented and alone, the hero confronts the possibility of permanent annihilation. What makes this encounter particularly devastating is that the familiar escape routes are no longer available. The old defenses, rationalization, projection, distraction, have been burned away in the Nigredo. One cannot simply return to the previous state of ignorance. Having glimpsed the shadow, one cannot unsee it. Yet, the new state of integration has not yet crystallized. One is suspended in a liminal space, belonging fully neither to the old world nor the new. The existential philosophers, particularly Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, understood this territory intimately. Kierkegaard's Sickness unto Death describes a despair that goes beyond mere depression, a fundamental alienation from one's own being, a sense of being trapped in a self that one both is and is not. Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead was not a celebration but a diagnosis of a spiritual crisis, the recognition that the traditional sources of meaning and value had lost their authority, leaving the individual in a void of nihilism. The alchemical texts offer a surprising piece of guidance for this stage. One must remain in the vessel. The temptation is to flee, to break open the sealed container and escape the intolerable pressure. But the texts insist that the vessel must remain sealed. The heat must be maintained. The operation must be allowed to complete. In psychological terms, this means one must resist the urge to prematurely resolve the tension, to leap to false solutions, to embrace any belief system or identity that promises quick relief from the uncertainty. This requires what the Christian mystics called dark faith, a capacity to endure not knowing, to remain present to the pain without demanding immediate answers. It is faith not in any particular doctrine, but in the process itself, in the possibility that meaning can emerge from meaninglessness, that form can arise from chaos. Jung termed this holding the tension of opposites, the willingness to contain contradictions without immediately collapsing them into resolution. The danger at this stage is twofold. On one side lies regression, the retreat to old patterns, the rebuilding of the persona exactly as it was, perhaps with minor modifications but without genuine transformation. This is a kind of death in life, a premature ossification that protects against further suffering but also forecloses growth. On the other side lies inflation, the premature identification with spiritual or archetypal energies, the delusion that one has achieved completion when one has merely glimpsed possibility. This can manifest as messianic fantasies, grandiosity, or the conviction that one has discovered ultimate truth. The authentic path through the crisis involves neither regression nor inflation, but what might be called radical acceptance, the willingness to be with what is without embellishment or denial. This is an act of profound humility, the recognition that one does not control the process of transformation, but can only cooperate with it. The ego, which has spent a lifetime trying to manage reality, must learn to surrender to forces larger than itself, not in passive resignation, but in active receptivity. The texts speak of this as the moment when the divine child is born, when the stone begins to form in the vessel. Something genuinely new emerges, not constructed by the ego, but given, received, discovered. Jung associated this with the activation of the self, that organizing center of the personality that transcends the ego. In mystical traditions, it might be described as grace, the descent of the Holy Spirit, or the awakening of Kundalini. The language varies, but the experience is remarkably consistent across traditions. A sense of being met, of receiving help from a source beyond one's personal resources. This does not mean the suffering ends. The Rubedo, the final stage of reddening, involves its own challenges, but the quality of suffering changes. Where before there was meaningless chaos, now there is purposeful struggle. Where before there was isolation, now there is connection, if not to other people, then at least to something within oneself that feels trustworthy, that can serve as an anchor in turbulent waters. The individual who emerges from the alchemical work is not fundamentally different in obvious ways. They do not acquire superpowers or transcend the limitations of embodied existence. They remain subject to aging, illness, loss, death. Yet something essential has shifted. Where before there was fragmentation, now there is coherence. Where before there was reactivity, now there is responsibility. Where before there was identification with limited aspects of self, now there is access to a fuller range of human possibility. Jung described the individuated person as having achieved a conscious relationship with the self. This does not mean the ego is dissolved or negated, but rather that it recognizes itself as part of a larger totality. The ego remains the center of consciousness, but it is no longer mistaken for the center of the personality as a whole. It serves the self rather than attempting to usurp its place. This relationship is experienced as a sense of being carried by something larger than oneself, of participating in a process that has its own intelligence and direction. Practically, this manifests in several ways. First, there is a reduction in neurotic suffering, not the elimination of pain, which is inherent to life, but the cessation of the additional suffering created by resistance to pain. The individuated person does not waste energy fighting reality, or demanding that things be other than they are. They develop what the Stoics called amor fati, love of fate. Not passive acceptance, but an active embrace of what is, including its difficulties. Second, there is an increased capacity for relationship. Having integrated the shadow, the individuated person is less prone to projection, seeing in others the qualities they deny in themselves. They can encounter other people as they actually are, rather than as screens for their own unresolved issues. This allows for genuine intimacy, the ability to be present to another without the constant interference of one's own needs and defenses. Third, there is a sense of purpose that arises not from external validation, but from alignment with one's own nature. The individuated person knows, in a way that transcends intellectual understanding, what they are here to do. This is not necessarily a grand mission or a dramatic calling. It may be something quite ordinary, but it is theirs, authentic, and this authenticity makes it meaningful. The Emerald Tablets promise. Thus, you will obtain the glory of the whole universe. All obscurity will be clear to you, can now be understood not as the acquisition of omniscience, but as a transformation of perception. The individuated person sees the world not through the distorting lens of ego needs and defenses, but with greater clarity. They recognize patterns, perceive connections, sense underlying unity without losing appreciation for surface diversity. This is what the text means by overcoming every subtle thing and penetrating every solid thing. Not literal superpowers, but a mode of understanding that penetrates beyond appearances. Importantly, the completion of the work does not end the work. Individuation is not a destination, but a direction. Each new life circumstance, each new challenge, each new relationship presents fresh material for integration. The spiral continues to deepen. But the person who has completed even one full cycle of the alchemical operations possesses something invaluable: the knowledge that transformation is possible, the confidence that the process can be trusted, the skill to navigate future crises with greater wisdom. The individuated person becomes in effect their own philosopher's stone, not a static perfection, but a living catalyst, a presence that facilitates transformation in whatever it touches. This is the true gold produced by the work, not material wealth or external power, but the capacity to transmute the lead of unconscious reactivity into the gold of conscious presence, to bring light to darkness, to find meaning in chaos, to participate creatively in the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. The Emerald Tablet conceals its ultimate secret in plain sight. The treasure you seek has never been external, the wisdom you crave has never been absent, and the transformation you pursue is nothing more and nothing less than the courage to recognize what has always been present, waiting in the silent depths of your own being for the moment when you stop searching and finally look.